right on 6:30, so I'm beaverly watching my watch going 6:29. Any takers on 6:29? Are we up to 6:30, 6:30, 6:30? Oh, there we go. Who said it? Somebody called it. Look, good evening, everybody. Welcome. So lovely to have you here tonight to this Respect Matters Forum, a really important topic. Thank you so much for giving of your time to be here. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Dr. Kate Hadwin and I have the absolute privilege of leading this incredible school, Pymble Ladies College. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Darramurrugal people, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and in particular, being a girls' school, to our emerging young female First Nations people. I also extend my respect to the Indigenous people who are here with us today. So on behalf of our Pymble College family, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all the parents who are from our community who have come to join us tonight, and also to the families who come from other communities. It's an important topic and one we all share together. I'd also like to welcome the many families who are joining us online tonight. Thank you for giving of your time. I'd like to thank our presenters, Anna, Marie, David, Judith, Michael, and our Pymble alumni, Angie, for giving their time to speak with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, really appreciate it, and you'll be formally introduced by Lamia in a moment. Now, do you remember that movie Apollo 13? And there was that, Punham's going, yes. There was that catchphrase line that sticks in our mind, and it's something like, Houston, we have a problem. Well, sadly, we clearly still have a problem in our society currently. I really want to congratulate and honour the incredibly courageous young people who have come forward to share their stories. These stories have started a movement that's long overdue. Sadly, based on the ABS statistics in 2019, there were 26,892 victims of sexual assault in our country. Now, let me tell you, that's about 74 a day. How sad is that? An increase of 2% on the year before, and in New South Wales, vastly overrepresented with an increase of 7%. And these statistics, of course, are only based on the people who report abuse or who did report abuse. Clearly, this is a really significant social issue for us. As schools, we are committed to educating your sons and daughters about sex education, sexual consent and respectful relationships. But as we all know, it takes a village to raise a child. The best outcomes occur for young people when schools work in partnership, first and foremost, with the young people who they are caring for, and then of course with parents, carers, the community at large, so that we can together improve the outcomes for all young people in Australia and more broadly. Congratulations for being part of this important conversation tonight. Your being here matters. We value your attendance and your contribution to this conversation. And now I'd like to hand over to our Deputy Principal Students, Lamia Rockwell, who's going to share with you a few details about the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening and welcome to our Respect Matters Forum. When this issue arose in the media, I worked with my team and we sought feedback from the students and we thought, yes, this will help us improve our programs. But what else could we do to help our community, not just our Pymble family, but the wider community? And I thought a panel of great experts will help us do this, along with Anna. And we're very lucky tonight that we have this amazing panel with us who will talk to us about various aspects of whether it's around sex education or sexual consent, and share up-to-date and practical information for parents and carers. This includes how to turn the tricky topics of sexual consent, assault and explicit imagery into positive and supportive conversations with your daughters and sons. It is my great pleasure to introduce our 5 experts and our moderator, Dr. Anna Rubinstein. Anna is the CEO of the Rites of Passage Institute and an expert in adolescent development with 30 years' experience as a medical doctor, counsellor, mentor, speaker and workshop facilitator. Marie Crabb is the project director of It's Time We Talked, Marie develops and delivers programs for young people focusing on sexual violence prevention, sexual diversity, pornography, and the prevention of sexually transmissible infections. She also presents about the impact of pornography at professional conferences and parent events in Australia and around the world. David Cobbler is the Director of Your Choices, with an extensive background in youth work, youth communication and leadership. David and his wife Katie deliver programs which encourage young people to make positive and healthy choices in relation to dating, relationships and sex. Dr. Judith Locke is a clinical psychologist at Confident and Capable and a former teacher who delivers child wellbeing sessions to parents, teachers and students in Australia and New Zealand. She focuses on teaching practical and proven strategies to give children the best chances of becoming genuinely confident, capable and able to realise their potential. Dr. Michael Salter is a Sienta Associate Professor of Criminology at the School of Social Sciences at UNSW and an expert in child sexual exploitation and gendered violence. Michael sits on the board of directors of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and he's an advisor to the Australian Office to the E-Safety Commissioner, the Canadian Centre for Child Protection and White Ribbon Australia. He's also the Associate Editor of Child Abuse Review and sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation. Angie Wang is a co-founder of Consent Lab, which provides educational sessions to teach young people how to navigate consent, respectively. And I'm proud to say Angie is also a Pymble girl who have graduated from the college in 2014. And now to some boring stuff around the housekeeping. In the unlikely event, hopefully not, of an emergency, please evacuate to the building calmly through the nearest exits. I'm trying to show you where they are, where you enter the doors to our Gloucester lawn, which is the lawn outside the chapel there. The bathrooms are located on the left-hand side as you enter the foyer. Please feel free to ask questions through the app that is shown on the screen. So Slido is basically you go into your phone web browser and you type in Respect Matters to join the forum. And you can type your question and hit send, and that will take us through to people behind the screens here who will be filtering the questions onto Anna. Please be mindful that there are 160 character limits to the questions, so please, if you can keep them as short as possible. If we don't get to answer all your questions at the end, we'll collate those and perhaps filter them through and send them through to you, the answers via email. On the topic of mobile phones, could you please ensure your phone is on silent mode? And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that some of the information we will cover tonight might be uncomfortable or upsetting to hear. It may stir up or trigger emotions for some. If you need to step out and take a moment for yourself, please help yourself. There's some tea and coffee out in the foyer as well. And our helplines are also shown on the screen, which is right above, right up there, quite high. Hopefully you can see them from where you are. And I'll hand over now to Anna to begin this important conversation. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Lamia. Thank you, Kate. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Thank you to our panellists. I also know that we have many hundreds of people online watching tonight from lots of schools around the state and around the country. So a big welcome to everyone. And yes, this is an important conversation. And yes, we do have a problem. But the problem didn't just spring up in the last week or the last month. We actually have a problem that has been present for way too long. I know that as a teenager growing up in Australia, I would say my entire formal sex education was possibly one science lesson. We had virtually nothing. And this is an opportunity for us to open a conversation about a critical part of the lives of our children and to look at ways that we can support them to navigate this time and hopefully get to a place where sex is a healthy, pleasurable and positive part of their relationships. So I'm going to start tonight with Angie. and you graduated here in 2014 and went off and started Consent Labs.
Yep.
So I would love to hear from you. Why did you start Consent Labs, and what is the definition of consent that you're using in your work?
Yep, so as you mentioned, I'm a proud Pymble alumni. I was at the college from K to 12, and it really formed me into an empowered young woman. I left the college knowing that I had a voice and pretty comfortable with using that voice. But it wasn't until maybe second year of uni that I realised that maybe I wasn't so comfortable with using my voice when it came to sex specifically. And I think that was a realisation that came after years of experience not feeling comfortable knowing what my boundaries were, not knowing what my rights were, and not having the language to express myself. And that kind of all came to a head when I had a discussion with one of my very good friends, Joyce, who's now my co-founder of Consent Labs. And we were just talking as two friends about how common it is, the catcalling, the groping, the feeling like you owe someone something. Also, a number of our friends were realising that they were survivors of sexual assault, but only months or years down the track. And I think underlying or underpinning all of that is a lack of understanding about consent. And I'll be the first one to put my hand up and say that I didn't know that consent even came into a sexual experience until my second year of uni. And that's way too late by that point. And it wasn't until I started researching for Consent Labs that I even learned what the definition of consent was, and that's agreeing to something freely and voluntarily. And the reason that I didn't know that, and none of my peers knew that, and most people don't know that, is because we're not taught it. It's not discussed in school, it's not discussed in the sex education that we received. And that's why we started Consent Labs, to change that conversation and empower young people with the knowledge and with the language that they need.
Thank you. So agreeing to something freely and voluntarily.
Yeah, that's right.
Great. And you work with teenagers in schools around the state. I hear now that you're booked out for the rest of the year and everything, and
Wow.
and that means you're in a very privileged position where you actually get to talk to a lot of teenagers.
Yeah.
And it would be great to share with the audience, what are they saying to you, and how are they experimenting or exploring their sexuality? What's going on that parents need to hear about?
Yeah, I mean, I think young people are really calling for education that is clear and direct. I think they're a little bit tired of education that beats around the bush and doesn't explicitly address their questions. I think young people are emotionally mature. They deserve the respect because they are, living these experiences in their own lives, and so they deserve to be talked to and supported throughout that as well.
Okay, I completely agree with you that they do, but I'm also interested just to hear from you a bit more about if you're noticing anything in terms of the conversations that you're having with the students still at school, whether sexual exploration is a common thing or whether they're waiting till after school, or what are you noticing there?
I think you can't ignore the fact that high school students will be engaging, or at least surrounded by, these situations, or exploring with their sexuality, whether it's themselves personally or their friends. And so our approach is to be proactive with the education that you give young people, because you'd rather them feel well equipped to handle situations rather than something happens to them or something happened to one of their friends and then they don't know what the options are or who to turn to. So I think the harm minimisation approach is a really important one.
Yeah, thank you. So Michael Sauter, you're an Associate Professor of Criminology, which is an impressive title. And what are you, in your work, what sort of stats are you finding in terms of the prevalence of sexual assault in the young, non-consensual sex?
Well, we know that half of all sexual assaults take place under the age of 17 here in Australia. So, being a young person is a significant kind of risk for sexual violence, and about half of those assaults are peer-to-peer. So they are a young person harming another young person. If we step away from the question of kind of criminal assault, research shows, and also, women will tell you that for the majority of women in our community, their first sexual experience, if it wasn't assault, was not necessarily at a time or a place of their choosing, or something that they would have chosen if they felt like they had a choice. And that doesn't mean that they've been assaulted, but it means that there's some questions here about free and voluntary, and finding a space for young people that is safe for exploration, that is not coercive. Because one of the challenges for a young person around consent is sometimes it's not yes or no, it's I don't know. And I don't know can be a creative place, it can be an exploratory place, or it can be a dangerous place if your I don't know is met by someone else's yes, definitely. And that's really difficult to negotiate as a young person, or an adult, frankly.
And you mentioned about criminal and non-criminal assault. I'm interested that that's even a term. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
So, I mean, certainly the question of consent in law is a kind of a red line, and over that line, we have a criminal offence, a criminal matter that is adjudicated by the criminal justice system, ideally. We'll bracket for a moment the fact that most people don't report to police because, frankly, the experience in the justice system is very poor. But before that line, there is a grey area of sexual violence where there can be a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment, a lot of humiliation, a lot of harm is done in that grey area, regardless of whether or not it meets the formal criteria for sexual assault. And a lot of harm for young people, a lot of sexual harm occurs in that grey space where there is uncertainty about the legal status of what's taken place. But we need to take that harm really seriously. Just because it doesn't meet a criminal standard doesn't mean that this is a young person that hasn't been hurt.
Thank you. And for clarity, so Angie talks about freely and voluntarily. In your work, what's the working definition of consent that you go with?
So, I mean, generally and unfortunately, across Australian jurisdictions, we actually have different definitions of consent in different states and territories. And we've had, very high-profile criminal cases that have been successfully appealed and overturned because the judge mistook the law of consent. It makes consent sound really complicated, and it's not complicated. It's doing something with someone who wants to do the same thing with you. We all understand what that is. We consent to things all the time. When you have a conversation with someone and they talk back, there's a mutual agreement between two people to engage in the conversation. And if one person doesn't want to talk, they just walk off. So we know what consent is. Now, the legal standard is an important one, but particularly in this discussion, recognising that the majority of people, even if consent has been breached, the majority of survivors, frankly, choose not to go to the police, and that's a more troubling issue for young people because we have obligations under mandatory reporting to report matters to police when we're dealing with minors. But even then, for young people, they may choose not to comply. So, there's a broad spectrum of sexual harm, and the criminal standard is just a part of that spectrum.
Thank you. And I think it's very important to mention also that whether it's criminal or not, there may be consent given at the beginning of something, but then one person may change their mind, and we now move into a place of non-consent. And part of what we need to be doing is educating and empowering everyone that if at any point what they're doing, even if they agree to it, feels wrong for them, that they have a right to speak to that and to not have to continue.
Yeah, definitely. I think something that is a common misconception is that consent can't be revoked or can't be withdrawn, and that's a really big myth that we try to dispel because, as you said, Anna, at any point during that exchange, whether it's a minute in, whether it's 5 minutes in, you can withdraw your consent and you're well within your right to do that, and the other person needs to respect your boundaries.
Yeah. And that was part of what came up with this idea of the consent app, that it was inappropriate because it was a sort of consent, but that things can change. And by the way, we're not talking about consent apps and we're not talking about milkshakes tonight, so that's it. Subject covered. Michael, you also talk about that teenage boys and young men are actually at the highest risk of perpetrating sexual assault.
Yeah, so boys and men through their teens and into their early 20s, this is where we see the highest rates of perpetration of sexual violence. It's not to say that we don't have perpetrators who are older, but again, this is sort of a key time, and it is ultimately what puts young women most at risk. And something that we can pay attention to really closely is the peer culture between boys. And the way in which, for some teenage boys, misogyny becomes a kind of a stand-in for a gender identity. Creating yourself, forming yourself as a man, creating a sexual identity for yourself. Misogyny offers sort of a shortcut to this. It offers very simple kind of black and white solutions to gender relations, and that can be appealing in a peer context where there might be a lot of physical assault. And we see a lot of physical assault between teenage boys, where teenage boys are quite closely policing each other's behaviour, particularly their gendered behaviour if they're seen as not being masculine enough. A lot of suspicion visited upon teenage boys who might value their platonic relationships with girls rather than seeking to sexualise those relationships. So, paying more close attention to the sorts of peer cultures that, boys and young men adopt and recognising why they do it. And yes, misogyny is in the culture, and yes, misogyny is in pornography and so on. But what is the function of misogyny for boys and young men? And I think ultimately it's protective. I think it protects them and defends them against some of the peer aggression and violence that we see amongst teen boys. And frankly, that is a significant driver of sexual assault.
And you also talk about the socialisation of girls.
So when we do research with girls and young women and we talk to them about consent and we talk to them about the sorts of requests that are made of them and the sorts of circumstances they find themselves in, what we find is that it's really hard for girls and young women to say no. That part of being socialised to be polite and agreeable and affable and nice and enjoyable as a girl or a young woman is to be agreeable and to agree to things. And that as sexual situations emerge or unfold, that for girls and young women it can be really hard to just say no. And it can be really hard to recognise and admit to yourself and to the people around you that something's happened that was wrong. And we continue to encounter a lot of resistance amongst girls and young women to even acknowledge that wrongdoing has taken place, because to admit that you've been sexually assaulted goes against kind of social narratives about girl power and empowerment and agency. We sometimes see girls and young women feel as though to admit something bad has happened is to sort of take on a victim identity, and I'm not a victim. I'm not a victim, so that couldn't have happened to me. And so I think, in our zeal to empower girls and women, I think we've overlooked the ways in which some very traditional understandings of femininity have persisted, such that, it's not hard to get a girl or a young woman to say yes to something she doesn't want to do. And it can be really hard for girls and women to acknowledge actually something happened and it was wrong and he ignored me, We've told girls and young women that we're in a gender equal world, and we're not. We're in a gender unequal world. It's just that girls and women deserve a gender equal world. But there's a difference. We're not there yet.
This is a big topic. Marie, let's make it even bigger. Let's talk about pornography. And why does pornography have to be part of the conversation? And also, how is pornography shaping the sexual behaviours that we're seeing today?
So I think building on what Michael said, there are a range of factors that shape young people's expectations. Gender stereotypes is one of them, and it's a really important factor. And pornography is an influencing factor that I think has a prevalence and power that we often are unaware of. It's become a significant shaper of, sort of a default sexuality educator for many young people now. So people may not be aware that in Australia, about half of young men have seen pornography by the age of 13, 48%, and 48% of young women have seen it by the age of 15. Pornography sites account for 3 of the top 10 most viewed websites in the world. So it is massive. It's a massive industry that puts it ahead of eBay, Netflix, Amazon, some really big names. And what young people are seeing when they see pornography is not just people having sex, and it's not the centrefold that it used to be. Pornography is conveying really deeply problematic messages about gender, power, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, about power, aggression, consent, pleasure, bodies, racism, a whole range of themes. And young people are seeing it on average, well, for young men it's 3 years before they have their first sexual experience, and for young women it's 2 years. Young men are seeing it, about over half of them are seeing it weekly or more often, and 17% of them see it daily or more often. So it's actually a very powerful shaper of sexual norms and expectations. Young people are not making decisions about their sexuality and what they consent to or what they think they're expected to consent to in a vacuum. They're making those decisions in the context of a whole range of influences, their peers, their partners, and society and culture more broadly. What they see, including in pornography, is shaping their sense of what, not just what might be pleasurable, but what might be expected of them. So when we interview young men in different countries, from different backgrounds, different socioeconomic groups, they talk about aspiring to or indeed initiating things that they've seen in pornography. And when we talk with young women, they confirm that their partners are initiating sort of the signature sex acts from porn. So, things like gagging, choking, spanking, hair pulling, name calling. And the young women talk often about really struggling, wanting to please their partners, wanting to be generous and accommodating in their sexuality, but often not wanting to do what porn promotes.
Yeah, can I say, and a lot more? I worked as an emergency medicine doctor for 15 years, and my first shifts were in 1990, 91, just when the internet was about to start. And in the years that I worked in the emergency medicine department, we clearly saw a spike in sexually related issues, specifically in girls, that were without any question related to what they were seeing in pornography.
Yep. So I think the way that pornography is often, anonymously, privately shaping sexual tastes and expectations. We know that young people are more likely to use pornography as a source of information about sex than to talk to their parents or to another family member or a health worker of some form. 60% of young men and 41% of young women have used porn as a source of information about sex in the last 12 months, even though they know and they say that they know that it's not realistic and it's not a very good way to learn about sex. I think we need to include pornography as part of open conversations that are frank and making sense in young people's lived realities. And we can't really afford to shy away from the conversations that connect with the real factors impacting on them, like pornography.
Yeah. And the stereotyping that you're seeing coming from pornography?
Yeah, so what pornography does very well, I think, is to kind of normalise female sexual subservience, to say that a woman's role in sexuality is to please and to derive pleasure from pleasing. The messages in pornography are very confusing, I think, because often the women do look like they're very pleasured, and I've interviewed porn performers who've described the expectation that they look as though they're behaving something, they're enjoying something that they're actually really struggling with the pain of. But of course you don't see that as a little tag at the bottom of the video. So we see sexual subservience in women, and we see this kind of hyper-masculinity in men, and we also see some of those same messages in gay male pornography. So it's not just heterosexual pornography where we see these messages. Some of the young gay men that we interviewed described the ways that a hyper-masculine male would treat a more feminised male with the same sort of aggression, degradation and disrespect that women get treated with in heterosexual porn. So it's very, at the same time, I think we need to be really clear that sexual exploration and interest and curiosity are normal and healthy and fantastic parts of adolescent development, and we don't want to, be negative about that element. It's completely understandable that young people might be interested in pornography. They often see it unintentionally, but they're also seeking it out on purpose. We used to look up, sex in a dictionary, which was a book when I was growing up. And if you look up sex online, then you're going to see porn. So we want to be really affirming and positive about sexuality, not sort of move into a shame and fear space around it, at the same time as being able to support young people to think critically about what they're seeing in pornography.
Thank you. Thank you. And David, you and your partner, Katie, travel all around Australia working in schools. And with lots of young people, which is fantastic. I'm interested, what are your thoughts in growing up in this digital age? Technology is not only giving the access to pornography, but many, many other effects. And how do you think that's different for the teenagers of today compared to, say, like an old man like me, how I grew up?
Look, I think all of us would say teenage years are often challenging. They can be tricky. We're kind of trying to figure ourselves out. It's often defined as a bit awkward, trying to fit into your own body. And I think that it's always been a little bit of a challenging time in life. But I think one of the things that's changed, like Marie even suggested, is just how we learn about stuff and the information that we get. Sex was something that there probably wasn't a lot of information about, or it was the Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever it was. It wasn't this ability to Google something. Parents, if they were having conversations early on, were able to be a very key educational place for a teenager growing up. But today, many parents feel like they have lost the ability to be that education. Schools, in many regards, have felt like, despite how much we're trying to talk about this stuff more, the internet still, for many, is the key place that young people are finding themselves going. Even we talk about parties and some of the things that happened in parties generations ago. Today, kids are being filmed, and we never experienced that. When we went for our first job, no one was Googling our name. And the reality is they're graduating school and most certainly their names are being Googled. So we can say there's been pressures and challenges that have always existed, but I think they've just been heightened to such a degree that it is really tricky. Social media can be incredible, but it can be really, really challenging for a young person to navigate. And I think what's really tricky is that parents want to help their kids in that space, but kids are feeling like their parents don't understand. Many parents would probably say that their kids are the one that fixes all the technology problems in the home. And so then how do you help your kids in that space? We talk about consent and like we've already been discussing, a lot of adults don't have a clear, concise way to discuss something they might not even be totally aware of. How do you teach kids about that stuff? For me, one of the things that I think is so important is we've got to get in on this conversation early, like really early. Like before sex is sexual, we've got to be talking about this stuff. And I think parents are still very well placed to have those conversations, but it's about equipping them with the information of how we talk about this stuff in an appropriate way at an appropriate age.
Great. And I definitely want to come around to that. I think it's critical that tonight we're not just talking about the issues and things that are going on, we definitely want to finish and spend a good amount of time around what can schools do, what can parents do, what resources are available, what conversations can we have. So thank you for that. But also you do a lot of work with boys, and I'm interested. What are you hearing from the boys? Because I'm interested whether it's similar or the boys are talking about. Do they even talk about consent? What do you hear from them?
Yeah, look, consent is a big conversation for teenage boys. I think one of the things that's very unique about the way the boys typically learn about sex is some of these gender things that we've been discussing. For instance, I could have 200 Year 10 boys in a room and I could ask them a question that would say, put your hand up if you've ever heard, if the majority of the time you've ever heard sex talked about, you've heard it talked about in intimate terms. That's the most common way you hear sex talked about, and no hand will be up. And I say, okay, well, let me ask you, who's had sex talked about most of the time if they've ever heard it discussed in terms completely devoid of intimacy? And every hand in the room will go up. And so we think about the influence of some of the things that already have been discussed, and boys are learning about sex as something that's about conquest and achievement and about personal pleasure, not mutual pleasure, and about their desire, not mutual desire. And so this is tricky because in the hearts, I believe, of many young men is a desire to have great sex, positive, pleasurable, mutual sex. But I think far too often there's a fear of that. And so as a fear mechanism of how to deal with that, well, we'll talk about sex as I achieve something. I very rarely hear young people talk about a pressure around sex in a way that is something that you wouldn't associate with playing a game or with achieving something, or they say they want to be good at it. And it's interesting because then the response is like, well, explain to me, what is it to be good at sex? And it's to look good. It's to be like the porn stars. It's to, and girls are saying exactly the same thing. It's almost disconnect from themselves and their own desires and their own pleasures, and it's about achieving something for someone else. Boys, if I ask boys and I say, okay, in a moment I'm going to talk to you about female desire and female arousal, you can hear a pin drop. They've learned about it from porn, but porn says everything that's done to a woman is pleasurable. But then all of a sudden in reality, when we talk about this stuff, that there's this desperation, talk to us about what is consent, what is desire, what should sex be? And one of the things that my wife and I are very passionate about is reconnecting sex back with intimacy. Because I think far too long we've talked about it as achievement and pleasure and pleasure for one, not for both. It's got to be about intimacy, love, respect, all these things that really is the human need that we all want. We've kind of said that doesn't matter. You can have sex first and hopefully you'll have a great relationship later. I think there's something in learning, well, what's a positive relationship look like first? And then when sex is part of the equation, it will benefit that, not be a substitute for it.
Thank you. Just before I come to you, Judith, there's one more thing that I want to bring up here, and that is, there are legal implications, obviously, in all of this, and we're seeing it in the media. We say that consent should be both parties freely, willingly, happily engaging. What happens when we throw alcohol and drugs into the mix? And we can say, well, it just shouldn't be there. But we also know that at parties, one of the main aims of many of the young people is to get their hands on alcohol and drugs. So how does that come into the whole conversation? Angie or Michael, who'd like to start?
I mean, broadly we can recognise alcohol increases the risk of sexual assault. That is true in licensed premises, that is true in parties, that's true in a range of different ways. It does not mean that people cannot consent to sexual activity when they're drunk. People have drunk sex all the time. It's not a criminal matter. It does complicate things. It does obviously disinhibit people. It can also incapacitate people. And we can recognise that alcohol is also used in a very premeditated way by some perpetrators in order to incapacitate a victim. And obviously it interferes with memory and so on, which then makes kind of criminal proceedings really, really difficult. So when we're talking about young people, and particularly young people living at home, then restricting, limiting, preventing their access to alcohol, it is a key safety measure. A lot of sexual assaults for teenagers are going to take place in a party context where there's a lot of alcohol. So it is something that we just need to keep in the back of our minds as a pretty obvious safeguarding lever that we can pull as adults, because we get to make decisions about the alcohol that's available to minors.
Angie?
I mean, I think that is an ideal world, but as you said, Anna, kids will be having alcohol and potentially other drugs. And it's a very common question that we get, because legally you can't consent if you're substantially intoxicated. And so the question that we get from a lot of students is, how much is too much alcohol or other drugs? How can you tell when someone is substantially intoxicated? And so when we go to schools, we discuss the idea that everyone has a different threshold. So you might have 1 drink and maybe that's enough for you, but someone else could have 7 drinks and maybe they're fine. So you need to be able to identify what your threshold is and know that other people might be different. But the basics and the principles of consent aren't different when you've had a bit of a drink or a bit of a drink. It still comes back to respect, and if you're ever in doubt, don't.
I used to work during schoolies in Byron Bay in the emergency department, and it was one of the more disturbing experiences of my life, because every morning we would come in and there would be a line of morning after pills and STD swabs, and we would have however many young women coming in who had done something the night before that they'd very possibly never done before, with someone who they'd very possibly never met before and didn't even know who they were. And inevitably alcohol was involved. And the other thing that really disturbed me was that when I would say to those girls, did you know before you even started the evening or that what you were doing, or did you know that it was a problem? Did you know it was not going to work out well? And inevitably, on some level, they knew, but they weren't listening to that voice. And also when I would say to them, where were your friends? Where were the people who were watching over? Where are the other girls or boys? And they weren't there. And that combination of not listening, not being supported, alcohol or drugs, I just saw as an absolute disaster, regardless of the legal consequences. I definitely saw the emotional consequences.
I mean, we have a culture that associates alcohol with a good time. There are different alcohol cultures out there. There are dry cultures where people drink, but alcohol culturally is not synonymous with a good time. Australia has a problem with alcohol, and people drink because they think that is the only way to really enjoy themselves. And, frankly, there is a multi-billion-dollar advertising industry and alcohol lobby that is there to sell them that message through TV and movies and advertising and all sorts of things. And so, what you're describing are circumstances where people are not, they're physically at risk, they're sexually at risk, they're all sorts of alcohol-related harms. It's one of the most common scenarios in which pedestrians are hit by cars, physical assaults between teenage boys. 18 to 24-year-old young men, physical assault is one of the leading causes of injury and death, and it's all alcohol-related. And it's got to do with our cultural associations with alcohol and the messages that we deliver around what alcohol means.
Thank you. So Judith, very patient, thank you. And you wrote a fabulous book called The Bonsai Child.
Yes, I did.
And there's quite a fabulous and controversial comment that you make, which is the disturbing link between high-effort parenting and poor outcomes for children.
Okay, I don't know if the crowd's with me or not now.
You can stop trying. The disturbing link between high effort parenting and poor outcomes for children. Who would have imagined?
It's funny you say that, because even when my PhD title, the whole room erupted in laughter when I was talking about overparenting. So,
But I'm interested in how that plays out in the sex and consent.
yeah. And
Well-
look, I think the parenting angle adds to the other angles we've already heard of pornography, of internet and things like that. But parenting has definitely changed. Can I have a show of hands in here? Who's a different parent from their own parents? And who's deliberately a different parent? I hope your parent's not sitting next to you. Okay, all right. So for the people at home, we've probably got about 80% of people agreeing. So parenting is always a product of its time, but particularly now it's changed in that a lot of parents now, their primary goal is to make children happy and successful all the time. And often there's high levels of parent effort that is going to make children happy and successful all the time. So often it's about sort of giving them pristine, sort of perfect lives, putting a lot of effort into making them happy all the time, giving them a lot of material things. And unfortunately, even though these are very good efforts, it comes unstuck because you're not really building critical things in them when you make it so easy. So giving them a life free of any disappointment means they don't build resilience. Reminding them all the time to do their homework means that they don't develop self-regulation, the ability to stop current pleasure for future gain. And so the trouble is with the best of intentions, this very hard work parenting, it's enormously hard work, it doesn't bring out good qualities. And so we know, for example, the child that's got everything they wanted in childhood is likely to be a bit more entitled, is likely to sort of expect people to make them happy all the time. Enter a situation where they're with a person they're interested in and they're expecting, they are used to getting exactly what they want. They're very used to sort of a sort of sense of entitlement and things like that. So that's where it sort of comes unstuck. It's not actually building the really important skills in children. Of course, I'm always, I don't want to say that parenting directly causes this, and everybody has their own free will to make changes and become a better person outside of a home environment that has been particularly indulgent. But unfortunately, we are bringing out the worst in children sometimes.
Thank you. And you talk about true equality starting in the home environment. Can you explain what you mean by that?
So some stats that may blow people's minds is that even though 82% of parents themselves did chores when they were growing up, only 28% of them are making their children do chores. And those chores in the home, on average, girls will do 50% more chores than boys will. And so you've already got an inequality about sort of the sort of subservient role of doing the washing up and things like that. And even to a certain degree, fathers are much more involved in parenting, which is a great thing, but often fathers are doing the sort of high status stuff, like the taking them to the game and things like that, whereas the mother's at home washing the uniform and, that sort of thing. That's in sort of heterosexual relationships. And it becomes one of these really sort of problematic things where boys are good, boys have the higher sort of standing in the family than girls. Now, this is particularly problematic, and I'm starting to see much more domestic violence from sons to their mothers. And it's often because the sort of family hierarchy goes father, child, mother. And so, and sometimes, it's not just only from sons, sometimes you see it coming from daughters. But it's a really difficult thing to sort of address because slowly over time the children haven't developed respect for the mother doesn't have enough standing in the family to demand back, and often the child is a superstar at school, so they're very reluctant to speak to the school counsellor or the teachers, talking about the fact that they've got bruises on them or they're regularly abused. So it's a real problem, and why I go to schools a lot trying to do the preventative measure of building the better skills in children rather than just giving them these fantastic childhoods that really don't end up being that fantastic for them.
Yeah, there's a significant piece of research that came out of the National University of Singapore called the Future Ready Report, and it talks about the critical importance of 21st century life skills, resilience, adaptability, emotional intelligence, and that we're now seeing that that is as important as the academic education, and that the two working together are so important, and that when the children are not getting these 21st century life skills, the risk is that they actually finish school and they're out in the adult world, but they're still internally and emotionally children. And that's
And the big problem with that too is that there's such an emphasis now on academic success, do you know, and really pushing that. And so often, say for example, one of the children in the home is rude to the parent. The parent says, "That's it, you know, I'm taking your computer off you, you've been so rude to me," which is often their only sort of choice in that moment. And the child is very clever. The child says, "But I've got homework due." You know, so, okay, well, there's the consequence gone. So they prioritise the school results, whereas I would always argue your child being respectful of you, particularly as a female in the family, but any sort of authority figure, is much more important than whatever English homework they've got that night. And you still should carry out that consequence so you build the right skills in them. Yeah, that's what I always would say is much more important.
Yes, I completely agree that what they're learning in the home also is what they're likely to take out into the world. And a lot of our work is around creating rites of passage and creating this transition. And so we do father-son programs, for example, but we also work with the mothers. And more we're finding mothers are arriving on or involved in the programs and are distressed at the lack of respect and their inability from their children, and they're saying that, you know, their children, especially their boys, are in their rooms playing violent computer games, and you know, they'll come out, they're eating, and then they're back in their room doing it again, and that whole respect thing is getting more and more difficult and is becoming a major problem. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, so Angie, you believe that sex and consent education should be compulsory in all schools.
Yep.
And I think that's a good thing to be believing, because for the first time it looks like that's really going to be happening. But I love what you've written here, which is that, and you sort of mentioned it a bit before, but I'm going to say it again, young people want sex and consent education that does not beat around the bush but addresses the point directly. They are demanding consent education that is proactive rather than reactive, as it has been. They want education that focuses on respect rather than legal consequences, and they want it to be diverse, inclusive, and relatable.
Yep. Yep.
And I think another belief you have is that ideally it should also be presented at least in part by young people.
Yep. I agree with that.
I'd love to hear from you. What is your ideal world? How would you like to see sex and consent education?
Yeah, so I think the first point that you raised is that consent education should be mandated in the curriculum. It's not currently. So in the New South Wales curriculum, it's covered in stage 5, so years 9, 10. And it's really up to the onus of the individual school and sometimes the individual teacher as to what extent they want to discuss consent education. And so what we're seeing is that it's not discussed to the extent or the depth that it needs to be. And evidence shows that consent education needs to be taught to a child at multiple points of their schooling career. So like David mentioned before, you can talk about consent before it's in a sexual setting, right? Like you can start discussing boundaries with the child when they're in a primary school age. And then slowly introducing the concept of consent as it does relate to sex, but nuancing that conversation as they progress through high school, because you're not going to remember something if you hear it once. And maybe you're not at that point in your life where you even care about, you know, engaging in relationships. And so it's just going to go over the top of your head. But if you hear it once, twice, maybe 3 times from different people, or presented in a different manner, or a little bit more nuanced, maybe it starts to resonate with you and you take it in.
Thank you. And David, working with teenagers, what's your approach, and how do you feel is the ideal way to be presenting sex and consent education?
Yeah, I certainly would agree and say that there needs to be this continued conversation, and I think the one-off definitely doesn't work. It's got to be something that's built on, and like you just shared, this idea that what's a Year 8 student, whilst it's very important for them to have an understanding around consent, probably Year 7, Year 8, a big focus needs to be digital consent, because that's more the years where there's big issues around inappropriate sending of nudes to others, to, again, in the same way, particularly for boys, to gain status, to have achieved something. It's really interesting. One of the reasons I find many young people describe of why they send a nude to another person is because of trust, because they said I could trust them. And I think this human desire for trust and that being something that's very important in relationship. Interesting, there was a 2016 study of survivors of revenge porn, and one of the outcomes that they found, almost every single one of the female survivors found, was a real lack or inability to trust anyone. Even very trusting people struggled to trust others moving forward. Also found PTSD symptoms, anxiety. So this idea of exploration around sex is now happening so much earlier in a digital space, well before it will in a physical space, which obviously is influenced by porn. So consent, it's not about holding a hand or kissing. That stuff's often happening before, hey, send me a nude or show me an image of a part of your body. And so I think this has an aspect that's very helpful when they're young and exploring that digital space, but also then in the physical space, which is often a little bit later, and it becomes applicable. Hey, I'm in the middle of this right now. You speak about consent into someone who's just entered a relationship and they're all ears. But when they're not even thinking about a relationship, it can seem a bit, oh yeah, whatever, this doesn't apply to me. And so that's why I agree, it's got to continue as they grow up.
And we're hearing clearly that children's exposure to sex is younger and younger. Most probably predominantly through porn, but also in the flow-on effect of that, of the conversations and different things that they get involved in. So, what is the right age? When and what do we start introducing so that we can be? I know, Judith, you talk about if we can be teaching our children young behaviours that will protect them and support them when they're older. So I'd love to hear from anyone who has thoughts on when and how we introduce appropriate education.
I'll go. I think it's just like I said earlier, we've got to talk about sex before it's sexual. Yep. Sex when it's not sexual is just like learning about anything else. It's a big deal for us as parents because as sexual beings we're thinking, oh my gosh, how do I talk about this? What do I say? I think often there needs to be parameters around what this conversation is and where it is safe to talk about this stuff. And I think having the family home being a safe place for that conversation is really key. Kids will more likely, if they've had early conversations, go back to the person who gave them the initial information, which is why I think if parents can talk about this early, they're more likely to go back with the questions, but then we've got to answer the questions. So if all of a sudden your child comes home and asks you a question about like a blowjob, you can't palm it off. Because if you say that's inappropriate or that's like, where'd you hear that? Or you grill them, they're going to go and Google it and then they're watching porn to get their understanding.
Okay, so you've mentioned the home environment a couple of times. And I know that you also have a framework for parents talking and broaching difficult subjects, whatever they are, with their children. Could you briefly talk to us about that?
Yeah, so my wife and I, we created this model. We call it the SAFER model. It's just an acronym. That's the way my brain works a little bit. So S is start the conversation as early as possible. Whatever you think would be the appropriate age to talk about any of these topics, you've got to wipe a few years off and go a bit earlier. So always start earlier than you think is appropriate. You've got to answer. A is for answer the questions openly and honestly. So you're going to get questions. If you talk about this properly with your kids, they'll ask you about anal sex, they'll ask you about masturbation, they'll ask you about blowjobs, they'll ask you about all these things that we can go, oh my gosh, I wasn't even just ready to talk about sex, let alone that kind of stuff. That's a whole nother world. How am I supposed to answer that stuff? But the thing is, if you don't answer it, if you don't have the conversations, someone or somewhere else, they will get that information. And what we find is when answers are given to kids and you have that look in their face where they look at you and go, that makes sense. And this starts from where a baby's made. If you say a fairy put it in there, like they're just going to go, that makes no sense to me whatsoever. Sometimes it's good to respond and say, well, what do you think? Because if they ask about a blowjob and you say, what do you think? And they say, oh, I just thought it was something to do with like blowing up a balloon or something. You might go, oh, okay, well, when we might be careful the way that we approach this. They haven't necessarily been exposed to something. And you can frame that in the way, the F stands for frame the conversation, use your family values. Again, respect is always really important. For us, our family values is respect has got to be involved in any sexual experience with another person. And so use that. We can keep going, but you get the idea. It's about early, it's about consistent. It's not a one-off. The birds and the bees never worked. It definitely doesn't work now. It's about these inappropriate things that are happening around us in society, talking about them, not turning off the TV, not trying to turn their eyes away from that scene in the movie. It's what did you think about that? What was that interaction like? It's these conversations that are consistently happening. Kids often would ask friends and say, can you ask your parent? Because they're the ones that can have the conversations with their parents. I remember I had a dozen Year 12 boys. I said, who's talked with their parents about sex, porn, sex and all this stuff? One of them put their hand up. Everyone kind of looked on. I was expecting them to laugh, but they weren't. They weren't laughing. And I said, what happened? He said, oh, my mum, she always talks. Never shut up about it. Always talk to me about this stuff. Okay. What about the rest of you? Nothing. No one talked to me. Well, what if your parents would have? Would you have preferred that? Every single one of them. Not now, Year 12, too weird. But back then, yeah, for sure. And so we've got to have that conversation early.
And your safer model is in the resources every person will be receiving, and it's described in there, and it's a great model.
Yep.
So thank you. And just a reminder also that we have our phone numbers for Lifeline and Beyond Blue, and please, if anybody is feeling that as a result of tonight's conversations that you would like to speak to someone and want some more support, we do have those resources available. So, yeah, Judith.
The other thing I'd really promote here too is that if we've talked a lot about the sort of the challenges of the internet and them having access to that, and I think it's really, or even the act of going to a party, I think parents can do a lot of work in terms of building their sense of responsibility before they get the right. So rather than your child nagging you to get the iPad or nagging you to allow them to go to parties, I think if you say, well, yes, when you show me maturity, that you can manage things and do this many chores and sort of show me that you remember to do it, then I will trust you to do this right, and keep in conversation with that and keep them doing that. Because I think if they only get it through nagging, you cannot trust them going to that party, having that iPad in their room, because they've not really built the right skills for it. And I think parents can totally pull back on giving this too easily to their child until they are sure they're mature enough to handle it.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I've had a parent ring me up because of my work and say, Dr. Rubenstein, I need some help. There's a party on. I'm worried there's going to be alcohol there and different things happening. And, I don't want my child to go, but they want to go. Can you talk to them, please? And I'm like...
I get literally phone calls from parents saying that my 4-year-old won't listen to me. Can you explain to my 4-year-old why they should listen to me? Which I say, well, no 4-year-old's going to say, you've made some good points, Judith. I will listen to them from now on. Like, it's just not going to happen. So often they do feel you've got more respect with their child than they do, which is an awful place for parents to be in.
Yes. Marie, we have a question, an anonymous question, like all of the questions tonight will be, about pornography education. And the question is that pornography education could prevent sexual abuse, self-harm, PTSD and suicide we see way too often. How young can we start? And how can parents and schools actually, how can we work to sort of minimise the impact, given that we know the incredible prevalence of availability and accessibility of pornography?
Okay. So I talk about 3 different approaches to addressing pornography's influence, or to building kind of competencies in children and young people with regard to pornography, and these are relevant for parents and for schools. The first is a foundational learning approach, and that's where we don't mention pornography at all, but we build related competencies from when children are very young. So the sorts of things that we've been talking about, help seeking knowledge and behaviour, being able to come and talk to us about things, respectful relating skills, understanding how to listen to someone else and share your view respectfully, online safety skills and behaviours, and importantly, I think, critical media literacy skills. So when we're seeing that ad, or we're seeing a television program where there's someone treating someone disrespectfully, we have the conversation, what did you think about that, and how do you think they would feel, and that kind of thing. Then as they get a bit older, we might have conversations with them about sexualised media, like ads and music videos that are really sexualised. Then as they get older again, we have conversations about porn overtly. So a foundational learning approach is not talking about porn. An integrated learning approach is where we do talk about it, but we do it in the context of a broader conversation, like pressure and consent. Pressure to join in with bullying another child, pressure to drink alcohol, pressure to watch porn or to do something that their partner's seen in porn. And then as they get older again, we have overt, clear conversations. That I call that a specific learning approach. So in a school, in terms of the curriculum standards, that specific learning approach about porn is more likely going to happen in year 9, 10. That's where it aligns with the curriculum standards. But we need to be doing some of that a little bit younger in the integrated learning approach. But we're always doing the foundational learning. I think part of what parents can do is we can try to limit children and young people's access and exposure. That's really challenging, but we still need to have a go at it. And we know there's a big difference between a child seeing porn and a child seeing 2 hours at night. And although we can't stop them seeing it at all, we probably can stop them watching 2 hours a night. So filters on devices, not having them in bedrooms and bathrooms, of course, in age-appropriate ways. And what we do with a 5-year-old is different from what we do with a 15-year-old. Then we need to support them to critique what they see in porn. Without showing them porn. It's not legal to show young people porn, so don't do that in school or at home. But and there are lots of good reasons to not be showing young people porn. But to be able to think critically about the kinds of messages that they get in pornography, I think that's a core skill. And then skills around being able to respond to pressure to watch it, or pressure to mimic it, or any other sorts of being able to be a good bystander when a friend is pressuring someone to do something. And then I think one of the really important factors is that we need to inspire young people that relationships and sex can be so much better than what they see in porn. And I think one of the things we need to be talking about with regard to consent is enthusiastic consent. I think that's a real paradigm shift. So it's not just yes, okay. It's to help our children and young people aspire to a model of sexuality where everyone who's involved in a sexual encounter really likes what's happening. They feel good about it physically, but also emotionally, relationally, socially. They feel good about it at the time and afterwards. And if that shifts during the encounter, that things stop. I think if we could encourage young men, young women, whatever someone's gender identity is, whatever form of relationship they're in, if they're being sexual with someone, that they aspire that they and whoever they're sharing their sexuality with now or in the future is only doing things they really want to do.
There are lots of questions coming through around pornography, and it's quite an overwhelming discussion. And I think very possible that some parents may feel, it really is enormous. And one of the questions that came through is, are there resources that parents can access that can support them to actually have these conversations, or that their children can watch?
Yep, so we have a website, it's timewetalk.com. You can't have porn in a domain name and hope that people will be able to access it from a school or wherever. There's information on there for young people, for parents, for schools and community organisations, including 7 parent tip sheets that you can download for free. Tip sheets on things like, how do I start a porn talk? What do young people need to know about porn? My child's seen porn, what do I do? Things like stay calm, don't make assumptions about what's happened, open the conversation up, always bring your values in. Conversations about porn are not really, the point is not really to have a conversation about porn. The point is to have a conversation about respect, mutuality, consent. Those are the principles that underpin whether people's experiences of sexuality are great or not. It's not how big your penis is or how beautiful you are that shapes whether someone has a great experience of relationships and sex. It's respect, mutuality and consent.
Great. And I like that we're moving the conversation into what parents can be doing proactively and hopefully what schools can be doing, and also this idea that rather than talking about all the problems and bad things that unfortunately happen way too often, this idea of sex being fabulous and wonderful and mutually incredibly enjoyable. And there's a question that's come through here. And this is open to anyone in the panel, about how may we help young women accept and value their entitlement to and capacity for sexual pleasure? How can we help young women accept and value their entitlement to and capacity for sexual pleasure?
Thank you for that question. Do you want to answer though, Angie? Go for it.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think the starting point for that is talking about it. When I went through school and I received sex education, there was nothing about pleasure, let alone female pleasure. And I think David kind of spoke about it briefly. You have that conversation with boys and they're not even aware that female pleasure is part of the conversation, but neither are girls. There's so much shame for all genders around sex, and I think this is something that I would say to the parents is be aware of the language that you use with your children. There's so much taboo placed on words around sex or phrases around sex that it makes conversations around sex awkward. So if you start normalising words like penis, vagina, clitoris, things like that from a younger age, then conversations around sex are not awkward, and conversations around consent are not awkward either.
Thank you. Anybody want to add to that?
Look, I think that pleasure and young women's pleasure is a key component of addressing the culture that suggests that, that kind of normalises sexual harassment and assault. I think if we put young women's experiences of pleasure, and I don't just mean physical pleasure, I mean all of those elements of their whole being, on the agenda for young men and for young women or for whoever they're being sexual with, then it opens up a window of a possibility of sexuality being seen as something that's mutual and not as a conquest. And I agree, in my experience of working with young people over many years, young men are often really interested in a conversation about female pleasure. It's just that too often we're not having the conversation with them. The porn industry is having the conversation with them, and perhaps their peers are, and often those conversations aren't particularly serious. So they need to know some really basic physiological things to start with, like that most women don't orgasm from vaginal sex alone. They need to know that the clitoris is an amazing part of women's bodies that generally women find very pleasurable, that women are diverse, that there are different, people like different things, and part of engaging sexually with someone part of what can be really exciting about engaging sexually with someone is to explore what they really like and what you really like together, find what works for you. So, and I think that sort of it can actually take away a little bit of that performance anxiety and pressure that young men might feel from watching pornography and thinking, I need to behave like that, take control, take charge, have a body that can perform like a male porn performer. So I think from when children are young, that we're frank about bodies and talk about our bodies, but also having overt conversations about mutuality. That is absolutely what sex should be like, whoever you're having it with.
And how fabulous to think that at the moment, the majority of sex conversations seem to be around either the scientific aspect of it or the consent or or problems or dangers or issues. And imagine if there was also an emphasis given around the beautiful, pleasurable, positive side, and that we could actually be starting from that point. So,
yeah, and I think part of that is for many people may feel nervous about like the concept of sexuality, our experiences of sexuality. It's a very sensitive topic, and the risk with things feeling sensitive and awkward is that they can perpetuate concepts of shame or disgust or negative phrases, negative kind of concepts of sexuality. And I think we need to be really careful not to move our awkwardness into shame spaces, that actually it's okay to name that this feels really awkward. And part of why it might feel awkward is because it's so intimate. It's such a personal part of who we are, our sexuality. We can name that and then say, but it's also fantastic, or it ought to be, and it can be. And if it's not being, then there's some fun work that you can do to work out how it can be.
I think one of the differences as well, I mean, when you raise as a boy or a man, your body's your own. It's really yours. You get to do things with it. You play sport with it. It's yours. There's never any sense that your body is someone else's there's never any sense that it's someone else's object. And sometimes what we often find with girls and young women is that the way they relate to their body is through someone else's eyes. It's how their body looks to someone else. It's how their body feels to someone else. And when you know what feels good for you, then you actually know what feels bad. It's easier to draw the line and say, I don't want that because I do know what I do like. But when you're dissociated from your body, and we live in a society that encourages girls to dissociate from their bodies, it becomes really difficult to know what's good or what's bad. And on a positive note, it's been really interesting to see the rise of the female sporting codes over the last 5 years or so women's AFL and rugby and so on. And it just strikes me how rare it is culturally to see a woman using her body in a way that's not ornamental. And so I was watching yesterday, it was in the paper, it was online or something, but it was that goal face that you only ever see from men, right? So it's that face, and it was on a woman. It was on a woman, and it was a woman running through the football field, just being like, "I kicked a goal," and there was nothing ornamental about this photo, right? It was just look what I did for myself and for my team. And I just think there's a broader point here about, what do we teach girls and women about the value of their bodies? Because that's what sexual pleasure is about. It's about what your body does for you, not what it does for other people.
yeah.
Sorry.
I watched the game. It was the AFLW Grand Final, and it was fabulous. Brisbane versus Port Adelaide. And exactly as you say, to see the women, fully engaging in the game in their celebrations, and it was very special.
Can I just pick up briefly, Anna, on Michael's comment about when women are engaged in their own pleasure, then I think part of what the evidence says is what you're kind of getting to there, Michael, is that they have a better chance of not just having a better experience of their sexuality in terms of pleasure, but actually being able to negotiate consent, being able to negotiate safer sexual practices. They end up being not just gatekeepers of someone else's sexual experience, but agents in their own sexuality. So if this helps with the move from kind of awkwardness to a positive conversation, then conversations about pleasure are good for equipping young women to have consensual sexual experiences, not sexually coercive or sexual assault experiences.
Thank you. We have a bit over 5 minutes left on the panel, and I have been told in no uncertain terms that I need to finish on time. And I do want to touch, though, before we go, on trust and creating a safe place for all of our children if they are in difficult situations. And there was some research that came out from Beyond Blue which says that in scenarios where students are struggling, one of the disturbing things that they've found is that they are more likely, rather than going to adults or professionals for help, they are more likely to go to their peers or to the internet. So I think personally that it's a critical thing. I have two sons, two grown sons, and I have a 19-year-old stepdaughter and a 17-year-old stepson. And we have these conversations, and I'm interested to hear around this idea of creating a safe place for our children when they are in a potentially dangerous or difficult or unknowing situation. Anybody want to speak to that briefly?
Look, I mean, I do a lot of work in the online space, and one of the things that we see is when things go wrong for kids online, they're so worried about getting into trouble and they won't tell their parents. And I've done research with young people who just talk about this and just talk about keeping the secret because they don't want to disappoint their parent and they don't want to be punished. And it's something actually that particularly adult perpetrators are really good at manipulating kids around. So, a big part of the conversation is it's yes, establishing standards and yes, talking about values and so on, but that unconditional moment where you say, if anything goes wrong, come to me and I will help. I will help. Because kids can end up living in their own little kid world and teenagers live in a teenage world. And the idea of actually stepping outside that and reaching out for help to a parent, sometimes it just doesn't occur. So really making that link that says, you can trust me, I'm on your team. If something happens, just let me know. It's an important moment.
I had a very clear agreement and have a very clear agreement with all my children that if ever there's an issue, and it doesn't, not just sexually related, but anything that's going on for them, that we actually have a code word. And they can come to me and they can say the code word, and the deal is, and we sat down, and I would encourage every parent at the appropriate time to have this conversation with your children and in your own way to say, if you are ever in trouble, know that you can come to me and tell me that you're in trouble or use the code word or however you do it, and I will help you no matter what without judgment. And that also extends to if you are ever at a party, if you are ever at a place and it doesn't feel right to you, you can ring me up and any time of the night I will come and get you. And even an extension of that is if you have close, relatives who are close with your children or older siblings or whatever, that you can actually set up with them and they have an agreement with your child that if they're in trouble, they can come and talk to them, or if they need to be removed from a situation, that there will be people there for them. Because one of the greatest worries for me ever is that a child is in a situation which they know is wrong, but they can't get out of it and they don't know a safe place to seek help.
I think also helping children and young people know that we understand that the world's complex, that things happen and things happen to us as well, and to kind of, not always be appearing like we're on top of everything ourselves, but to kind of let them see a little bit of how we might, go and talk to our sister or have whatever conversations we need to. So we're sort of modelling that sometimes things happen to us that someone else has done, or sometimes we stuff up, and we can own that, acknowledge that, and get some support. I don't mean talking to them in detail about our private problems, but just for them to know that we get it, including on porn. One of the things is to say to young children that the online world includes a whole range of things. Lots of them are really great, but some of them aren't. And I want you to be able to come and talk to me if you see things that make you feel uncomfortable, that you feel maybe aren't right, or maybe that you think are really weird and curious and interested. I want you to be able to talk to me about all of it.
Yeah, thank you. Judith.
And it's really important to schedule time to talk to your child. Do you know what? I think it's very easy for them to be busy in their lives and you to be busy. One of the easiest ways to do that is do chores together, like cook Sunday night meal together, and great time to chat. And the other really important rule is do not allow children to have headphones on in the car or be scrolling their phone in the car. Car is the time to talk or sit in companionable silence, but you miss a major opportunity to be having a really nice chat with your child in that moment of both staring at the road.
Agree. The car is a very special place. Where when I was a kid, we'd go away in the car and we'd be hearing stories from our parents about how they grew up, how their parents came to Australia, so many things. Now I see the kids in the back of the car with headphones on and an iPad or whatever.
You get to know their friends if their friends aren't allowed on their phone either. So when you are driving them home from the party, you hear what's going on, and that's a really important way to communicate.
Yeah. David, briefly.
I was just going to quickly say, I think the other thing is we've got to be careful about how we approach the situations that happen around us with other kids or other things that are happening on the news, and are we empathetic to what that person is going through, or are we judgmental? Because I think sometimes we can make judgment of the circumstance, and the young person hears that and goes, if I ever find myself in that circumstance, I know what you would say. I've heard what you've called that person. I've seen what you've said. So sexting is a classic example. It's the biggest generational gap. Parents don't get it. Kids, if they've been involved in it, I've heard what mum and dad said about that person that got found out, or that person that ended up in the news. They called them an idiot. They called them stupid. There's no way I could talk to my parents about this.
Yes. So tonight we can label tonight's conversation as actually an unfinished conversation. And the idea of tonight was to open and to start a conversation for those who haven't been involved in it, and to continue it for those who have, and to recognise that this is something we need to be talking about. This is something that has to be a whole community approach. We need to be empowering our children, but we also need to be involving parents. We also need to be involving the school, and we need to be involving our whole community. All of the panellists have, everybody will be receiving a digital handout, and the panellists have some resources in there. We have very little time left, so just 15 seconds. What resources do you have that are in the handout that people can look at? Angie?
I think some handy tips for parents. So what David pointed on, don't be judgmental, and as I said earlier, just be conscious about your language.
Michael?
I recorded a series of videos in Canada for young people, so they'll be launched in Australia for you. But it is, in fact, resources for young people and for teenagers around sexual boundaries and healthy relationships.
Marie?
So as well as the itstimewetalked.com website, we're on social media. You could follow us, and there's various information that comes through there. And we have 2 documentary films, Love and Sex in an Age of Pornography, that's been broadcast in 35 countries, and The Porn Factor, that's been broadcast here on SBS. You can rent them on our website. And there's also some little excerpts of our interviews with young people and porn industry professionals that you can see for free on our website.
Great, thank you. David?
So there's that safer model that I got halfway through and then realised it was taking too long. So I can go check
Good
it out.
awareness.
Yeah. And they can go to our website. There's some parenting stuff on there too.
Great.
And my parenting book, Bonsai Child or Bonsai Student, really just getting the relationship right with your child to move on. And I write a weekly parenting column, which is on my Bonsai Child or Confident and Capable Facebook page.
Great, thank you. And my resources are around some parenting tips for building strong relationships, things like spending time one-on-one together and sharing stories, and also a model which we call the golden check-in, which is a way of checking in with people in the family using the letters golden to see how they're going, what they've been doing, what they've liked, what's been difficult, etc. So I'm going to hand back to Lamia, but I just want to say a big thank you to our panellists for the conversation, and to everybody for coming along tonight, and for all those who are out there in virtual world watching. And a huge thank you to Pymble and especially you, Lamia, for all the work that you did to create this, to arrange it, and to give us this opportunity.
Thank you. It's not thank you to me, but thank you to Judith, David, Marie, Michael, and Angie, and especially to you, Anna. It's a very insightful conversation. I was behind the scenes, listening and looking at the questions, and there are so many questions coming through, but this conversation was flowing so nicely. It was hard to interrupt it. So we will keep those questions in archive. We will answer those questions and send them back to you in an email. In addition to that, we will also send you all the tips that the panellists have provided tonight, as well as some resources with those. So please join me in thanking the panel, and Kelly's going to help me with just handing out some small token of appreciation. Thank you so much, Judith, again, David, Marie, Michael, and Angie. Thank you so much, and thank you for those parents watching from home as well. I know we had about 300 parents online this evening, so thank you again for being here with us tonight, and thanks again. Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you.